Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
British fuel refineries where oil is turned into petrol and diesel could face severe difficulties in the aftermath of a no-deal Brexit. That's according to industry leaders and documents seen by the BBC. Under current plans for a no-deal Brexit, the government says it will not impose duties on imports. That might mean cheaper petrol from places like Russia on sale here. Good for us, the consumers, in the short term, but potentially not so good for the industry, with British refined fuel exports facing a 5% EU tax. Documents obtained by the BBC also reveal the extent to which councils are already stockpiling fuel in preparation for a no-deal Brexit. Here's our economics editor, Faisal Islam.
By the Humber, tankers fill up with petrol that has just been refined from North Sea oil at one of the 6 remaining refineries in the UK, pumping out the petrol and diesel used by millions of vehicles. According to contingency planning seen by BBC News, there is a danger to their viability under the government's current no-deal Brexit plans. The specific problem is that under no-deal Brexit, these refineries now face a near 5% tax on exports, known as a tariff, into the European Union. It is currently zero, with the UK as a member of the EU.
And obviously anything that puts UK industry at a disadvantage, particularly in a post-Brexit world, is not something we think is a good idea. If we export petrol to Europe, we'd face a 5% tariff, whereas a European refiner importing to the UK would face no tariff. So
doesn't sound like very much.
It's not a level playing field, but believe me, in the context of refining, 5% tariff is a significant figure.
On top of that, in order to keep pump prices for British consumers down after a no-deal Brexit, the government has allowed all petrol imports in at a zero tariff. That makes the fuel produced here at the refinery in Pembrokeshire, Wales, uneconomical for exports to Ireland just across the Irish Sea, and yet at the same time leaves the production here outcompeted by European refineries for use within the UK. That is why a local authority Brexit planning document from Anglesey, seen by BBC News, says Pembrokeshire Valero is a significant contributor to overall UK fuel supply, and if they cannot compete on equal terms with EU markets, then there is a danger to their viability. But there is more than that. Under World Trade Organization or WTO rules that will apply after a no-deal Brexit, the UK government's offer of zero tariff free access to EU refineries must apply to the world's refineries too. And the industry has told government that that means an increased dependence on the likes of Russian fuel. Isn't it a good thing for consumers though if they can get cheap petrol from Russia everywhere else in the world?
I think the inflationary pressures long-term of having a dependency on an import market would actually be a disadvantage to consumers. Do we want to be dependent on any country outside of the UK for our fuel?
Is that really a possibility? We could become fully dependent on imports?
We could end up in a situation where it becomes extremely uncompetitive for a domestic industry to stay in the UK.
Although these same companies have gone public to the BBC on the threats to their refineries, they are understandably far more shy on the impact of a possibly imminent no-deal Brexit on fuel availability. But other internal council documents seen by BBC News shed a light on existing preparations. Aberdeen Council has 2 weeks of bunkered fuel and says of the UK-wide worst-case no-deal scenario, the national planning assumption suggests that fuel shortages will largely impact on the southeast. Dorset Council, among others, have identified key staff who would require fuel warrants, special licences to obtain emergency supplies. Chichester District Council, in a document marked confidential, outlines plans for purchase of a 24,000 litre tank and fuelling station, circa £25,000 to £30,000, so that its services don't have to operate hand to mouth in a fuel shortage after a no-deal Brexit. The system to deal with fuel shortages, the National Emergency Plan for Fuel, is already well developed after the gridlock caused by fuel protests in 2000. Now councils are going to notable lengths, but there are wider concerns about the viability of large parts of this vital industry.
And Faisal is here with me. The consumers and the industry, Faisal, what sort of judgment is the government making in all of this?
It's quite a dilemma for government arising out of a no-deal
Brexit, and in other industries they made a different judgment. So farming, ceramics, they chose to protect the UK domestic industry by essentially making it more difficult to import. They've made a different judgment with petroleum, of course, and they would argue because they want to protect the consumer, the price of the bill at the pumps. They want to keep that down in the event of no deal. But now we've had the industry say, well, that has an impact on us, it has an impact on our refineries. That's the dilemma. Scottish and Welsh governments have written a letter, I understand, expressing alarm about what they say is the harmful impact on a strategically important sector, and want the government to take immediate steps to protect the industry. The problem is if they change the no-deal tariff for this industry, they may well have to change them for all.
Faisal, thanks very much. Now, throughout this week across BBC News, we're looking at the issues facing farmers in the UK, and today we focus on Brexit. The UK's farming unions have warned that leaving the European Union without a deal would cause severe disruption to the industry. The government's farming minister, George Eustice, said the government would support the sector through what he called short-term turbulence. Gareth Barlow reports.
Brexit has brought uncertainty to agriculture, but nowhere more so than here on the Irish border.
Hard, hard, hard!
Owen Martin's family have farmed dairy cattle in South Armagh on the very edge of Northern Ireland for nearly 100 years.
You wouldn't think there was a border. Many times you're across the border and you don't realise it. The no deal is chaos going to be. Nobody seems to know what we can do. Stock you can hold on, but your milk has to, our tank's full every other day. Second day at the border, it's a hard border, we have to throw it out. That's our livelihood.
So what do you need to see? What's the best possible outcome going
forward? A deal
forward?
and a transition period.
Hundreds of thousands of animals and millions of litres of milk cross the Irish border every year. It's somewhere around here, but there's nothing to show exactly where it is. For the businesses and for the people on both sides, it's practically invisible. Unlike here between Sweden and Norway, where you simply can't miss the border, this crossing from an EU country into a non-EU country is not only a physical barrier, but also impacts the decisions made by the Norwegian government and their farmers. Norway isn't in the EU, but it is a key trading partner, a situation the UK will be keen to replicate. The country's agricultural policy is focused on guaranteeing food prices and supporting Norwegian farmers. One of the biggest challenges for farmers like Bjorn is competing against the size of the European Union.
We feel that it's always in favour of the EU because we are not able to compete on the EU market. There's a strong support for agriculture in Norway by the consumer and by the government and parliament. So, and the best paying market is right here outside my barn door.
Back in the UK, farming unions have called on the government to strike a deal with the EU and do more to support British farmers.
We spent 3 years planning for a no-deal Brexit. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that the border flow continues. And we're also going to put in place support for sectors like sheep that may be affected through that short-term turbulence.
Confidence in Westminster, but even among farmers who support Brexit, there are calls for clarity.
I probably would vote the same way. The problem is we've let politicians take over and do it, and that's where the problems arise. It doesn't matter what happens come, is it 31st of October? We just need to know what's going to happen. That's just knowing. This uncertainty has been the biggest challenge.
For farmers, dealing with Brexit is like dealing with the weather. The question being asked across the sector, what's coming next? Gareth Barlow, BBC News.
Well, a worst-case scenario for a no-deal Brexit. That's what an official government document leaked over the weekend to the Sunday Times shows, according to the Minister in charge of Brexit preparations, Michael Gove. But what exactly does this Yellowhammer leak tell us that's new? And is it true that Michael Gove claims that it's out of date, superseded by the actions taken since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister? Our economics editor, Ben Chu, is with me again. Ben, we've heard it before about Yellowhammer, but what actually is in this document?
Well, you're right. So Yellowhammer, we know about it. Its existence has been talked about in a National Audit Office report back in March. The significance of this is not so much the fact that it exists, it's the fact that we know that ministers have been told in black and white, as we've been reporting on Newsnight, exactly what those impacts are going to be.
And what are the impacts? What do they warn about?
Well, there's a lot in there, but let's take two very salient ones. There's the transport disruption as a result of the new customs checks. What it says is that on day one of a no-deal Brexit, it thinks that the flows of trucks across the channel could fall by half. And over 3 months, that might still be down by around 30%. And it's because of that transport disruption that you get all these other risks, such as risks to the supply of medicines, food, and potentially fuel.
But Michael Gove tells us that this is all out of date. This was what, at the end of July, and it's all changed?
Well, I've been talking to various business groups and experts today, and I've put that very question to him. So what's in this leaked document? Does it look out of date to you? And their response is very clearly, no, it's not out of date. It all applies. Some actually said it could actually be worse than that, not least because, as we've been hearing, the immigration rules could choke off the supply of much-needed EU labour. And
are you getting any sense that ministers are operating now to mitigate what is this worst-case scenario?
Well, they have put more money in it. We know that Sajid Javid has put more money for Brexit preparation. We know, as we reported last week, about this 300 million tender for freight services. There are problems with that, as we again highlighted last week. There is clearly going to be a blitz of information on small businesses to try and get them ready. There's talk of automatic enrolment in the most basic customs paperwork. But, Kirsty, the fundamental problem is the fact that ministers can prepare as much as they like, but so much is going to depend on the actions of small businesses, foreign governments, foreign companies. So much is out of ministers' hands.
Ben, thank you very much indeed. Well, somebody's going to have to do an awful lot of work to get all this to work. And Paul Carter is the Conservative leader of Kent County Council, which includes the Port of Dover, and has been undertaking substantial no-deal planning. Councillor Carter, thank you very much. Had you ever seen the Yellowhammer document?
I mean, I'd heard of its existence, but, you know, I do believe it is somewhat out of date since that was produced. We've got a new Prime Minister, a new Cabinet, and the first thing that the new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, announced was that we need to turbocharge our preparedness for a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October. And I believe that new Cabinet team is very united in making sure that the civil service respond to their requests. One of the big issues that is unresolved, and it does highlight some of the issues that need to be dealt with in the next 74 days, fast, is the customs clearance, the border control papers that exporters, the logistics, the haulage industry need to have to make this work, so that we've got fluid movement out of the port of Folkestone and Dover to mainland Europe.
There can't just be one set of documents. You're dealing with all sorts of different cargoes, all sorts of different timeframes.
Yes, but I believe that there are a common sense, simple approach to managing this. We need to make sure that the logistics industry and the exporters know what paperwork is needed. Much of that can be done desktop, so that they've got the right clearance before it leaves the exporters or the logistics premises, and the establishment of additional customs stations, customs posts across the country, not just in Kent. Because what we hear...
Might you have different lanes for example, just-in-time medicines? Might you have different systems?
Priority freight is a separate issue. I mean, that's quite a small proportion of the overall freight that will be going in and out of Dover and Folkestone on a daily basis.
What about people going in and out of Dover and Folkestone? Because, of course, as of the 31st of October, you know, there's no free movement.
Provided they've got the right customs clearance papers, and we know what consignments are on those lorries at any one time, which is already in existence. When lorries arrive at the Port of Dover, customs need to be aware of what is on board that lorries, and they will be mixed consignments of goods.
Yeah.
That needs to be registered, the right paperwork, cleared, so that they've got the right clearance before they get anywhere near the port.
So what, I was going to say, because if it's at the port itself, that's where you get the clog up. Now, in the worst case scenario, what are the delays that you're looking at?
Well, I'm hoping that if they create a sensible system and communicate that to all of those involved in the export and import industry, that we can have free-flowing movement in the way that we currently do. If you talk to the president of the Port of Calais and Boulogne, Monsieur Poisson, he's also the deputy mayor of Calais, he said that the fear of massive disruptions is, in his words, c'est la bullshit.
Yes,
he believes that provided both sides create a sensible system on a no-deal Brexit, be under the WTO conditions, that there is no reason, if civil servants work together, we work together with our French counterparts, we can devise a system that allows fluid movement to take place and delays minimised.
When you did the test and we had the law, we had the queues of lorries, and we saw how fast they went through, that is not anything like the volume that you may be faced with. I mean, what's your capacity in Kent?
Well, if we do get delays, we've got the capacity to hold about 12,000 lorries, but for the first time, unlike Operation Stack, which closed the M20 on some occasions in both directions, to keep the Queen's highways in Kent open at all times. So we've now got a system that I believe is operable, which will actually reduce the disruption to the Kent economy, to Kent travellers, really substantially. But that is dependent upon the customs papers, the border control papers, being prepared and ready as they enter both ports.
What's the likelihood?
Well, I think that if people get their heads together and they turbocharge their work, that they can create a system, but most importantly, communicate it to everybody in the import-export business, the haulage industry, the logistics industry, so everybody understands what is needed to make this work.
Thank you very much indeed.